My wife said she was at a work retreat. When I checked her iPad, I found photos of her with my best friend and a bank transfer that proved they were planning to leave me homeless by Monday. David lived by a simple rule: numbers don't lie. As an accountant, he believed that if you looked closely enough at the data, the truth would always show up. He applied this logic to his marriage with Sarah for 10 years, and for a long time, the math added up. They had a comfortable house, a teenage son named Leo, and a routine that felt safe. But lately, the numbers had stopped making sense. The change started with Sarah's phone. It used to be just an object on the table, but now it was a guarded secret. She started taking it everywhere, even to the bathroom. David noticed she began locking the door, something she had never done in a decade. He would sit in the hallway, hearing the faint vibration of messages arriving late at night, and the silence that followed as she typed back in the dark. Then came the late nights at the office. Sarah was a marketing manager, and she claimed a new client was demanding all her time. But David noticed things that didn't fit a business meeting. One evening, she came home at 11 p.m., smelling not of coffee and office air, but of expensive cologne and wood smoke. When David asked how the meeting went, she didn't look him in the eye. She just walked straight to the shower, leaving her clothes in a heap on the floor. David's son, Leo, began to notice the tension too. The boy stopped asking his mother for help with homework because she was always too busy or too tired. The dinner table, once a place of laughter, became a place of heavy silence. David felt the pressure building, not just from his own doubt, but from the way his son looked at him, silently asking what was happening to their family. Driven by a gut feeling he couldn't ignore, David decided to check the facts. He knew Sarah's iPad was still synced to her phone and usually sat in the kitchen drawer. One morning, after she rushed out of the house, he opened it. He didn't have to look far. He found a series of deleted photos in the recently deleted folder. They weren't of work events. They were pictures of Sarah in a high-end restaurant David had never been to, looking happier than he had seen her in years. In one photo, she was holding a glass of wine, and a man's hand was resting firmly on her shoulder. The hand had a very specific tattoo of a compass on the wrist. David felt a cold shiver go down his spine. He knew that tattoo. It belonged to his best friend and business partner, Mike, the man he shared an office with every single day. But the real shock came when he scrolled to the last photo. It was a screenshot of a bank transfer. Sarah hadn't just been seeing Mike. She had been moving large sums of money from their joint savings account into an offshore fund David didn't recognize. The affair wasn't just emotional or physical. It looked like she was planning to disappear and take everything they had built with her. Just as David was trying to process the double betrayal, the front door clicked open. Sarah was back, claiming she had forgotten her keys. But she wasn't alone. He heard Mike's voice in the hallway, laughing as if he owned the place. David barely had time to slide the iPad back into the drawer before Sarah and Mike walked into the kitchen. The sight of them together, his wife and his best friend, felt like a physical blow to the stomach. They looked perfectly normal. Mike gave David a friendly slap on the shoulder, the same way he had done for 20 years, while Sarah complained about the morning traffic. The tattoo of the compass on Mike's wrist was right there, visible under his rolled-up sleeve, mocking David with every gesture. The most disturbing part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the performance. Over the next hour, David watched as they sat at his kitchen table, discussing a fake business deal. Mike spoke about future investments while Sarah nodded, occasionally touching David's hand to show affection. It was a calculated display of normalcy designed to make David feel like the crazy one if he dared to speak up. He realized then that he wasn't just dealing with an affair. He was dealing with two people who had practiced their lies until they sounded like the truth. David decided to play along. He needed to know where the money was going before he made his move. He acted the part of the tired, unsuspecting husband, but his mind was racing. Every time Mike laughed, David thought about the offshore account. Every time Sarah smiled, he thought about the photos in the deleted folder. He realized that if he confronted them now, without a plan, they would simply deny everything, gaslight him, and likely vanish with the rest of the savings. The pressure at home reached a breaking point 2 days later. Sarah announced that she had to go on a leadership retreat for the weekend. She was packing a suitcase with items that were far too elegant for a corporate seminar. David watched her fold a silk dress he hadn't seen before. He asked her, in a casual tone, if Mike was going to be at the same retreat. Sarah didn't flinch. She simply said that Mike was staying behind to handle the office, her voice steady and convincing. That afternoon, David went to their shared office. He waited until Mike went out for a client lunch and then accessed the company's financial records. He discovered that the betrayal went even deeper than he thought. Mike hadn't just been helping Sarah move personal money. He had been siphoning funds from their business for months. The company David had spent his life building was a hollow shell. They were draining him dry, preparing to leave him with the debt while they started over somewhere else. David felt a cold, sharp clarity. He wasn't just a victim. He was an obstacle they were waiting to remove. He began to notice small, terrifying details. He found a new insurance policy in the mail one Sarah had taken out on his life just 3 months ago, with her as the sole beneficiary. The realization hit him like a freight train. They weren't just waiting for him to find out. They were waiting for him to be out of the way entirely. The hook came on Friday evening, just as Sarah was supposedly leaving for her retreat. David followed her, not to the airport, but to a small, private airstrip on the edge of town. He watched from a distance as Mike's charcoal sedan pulled up next to a small chartered plane. But as they began loading bags onto the aircraft, a third person stepped out of the car. It wasn't a pilot. It was a lawyer David recognized, the one who had handled his father's estate. The lawyer handed Sarah a thick stack of documents and a set of keys. David crept closer, hiding behind a transport crate. He overheard the lawyer tell Sarah that everything was ready and that the house in David's name had already been listed for an emergency sale through a forged power of attorney. David realized that by Monday morning, he wouldn't just be a cheated husband, he would be homeless, bankrupt, and legally erased. But then, Sarah said something that stopped David's heart. She looked at Mike and asked if the problem with Leo had been taken care of. Mike checked his watch and nodded, saying the boy was already on his way to the special camp they had discussed. David's blood ran cold. Leo wasn't at his friend's house like Sarah had told him. His son was missing, and the two people he trusted most were the ones who had taken him. David didn't wait for the plane to take off. He backed away into the shadows, his mind screaming. He didn't care about the money or the house anymore. The logic of the situation had shifted from financial survival to a rescue mission. He drove like a madman to the house of the friend where Leo was supposed to be staying, but the driveway was empty and the windows were dark. He tried calling Leo's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. David sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He had to think. Sarah and Mike were calculated, but they were also arrogant. They thought David was a passive observer, a man who only cared about spreadsheets. They didn't think he would fight back, instead of calling the police. Immediately knowing that a special camp could be a legal loophole his wife had exploited, David went back to the only place where the truth was kept, the office. He bypassed the security cameras he had installed himself and went straight to Mike's private safe. He knew the code. It was the date their company was founded, a date Mike always bragged was the start of their empire. Inside the safe, there were no gold bars or stacks of cash. Instead, David found a leather-bound folder. Inside was a signed contract for a private residential facility for states away. Specialized in behavioral correction, Sarah had signed the papers using forged medical reports, claiming Leo was a danger to himself. It was a perfect kidnapping disguised as a legal medical intervention. She was removing the only witness who could testify about her erratic behavior and late-night visitors. David's hands shook as he took photos of every page. He then found something even more damning, a flight manifest. They weren't just going on a weekend trip. The plane at the airstrip was headed for a non-extradition country in Central America. They were leaving tonight, and they were leaving David to pick up the pieces of a ruined life and a missing son. He realized he had exactly 3 hours before the flight departed. He couldn't just go to the airstrip and start a fight. Mike was stronger, and Sarah was a master manipulator who would call the police on him. He had to be smarter. He used his administrative access to the company's main server and triggered an emergency fraud alert on every account linked to Mike and Sarah. Within seconds, their credit cards, including the ones they needed to pay the pilot and the private airstrip fees, were frozen. Then, he made a move they never expected. He called the one person Sarah feared more than anyone, her own mother. David knew that Sarah had spent years building a perfect daughter image to secure a massive inheritance. He sent the photos of the affair and the offshore accounts to his mother-in-law with a simple message. "This is what Sarah is doing to your grandson." David arrived back at the airstrip just as the pilot was arguing with Mike near the hangar. The pilot was refusing to board the luggage because the payment had been declined. Sarah was pacing, her face twisted in a look of pure rage that David had never seen before. The mask had finally cracked when David stepped into the light of the hangar. Sarah froze. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She looked at him with cold, dead eyes and told him he was making a mistake he would regret. Mike stepped forward, his hand curling into a fist, the compass tattoo on his wrist looking dark under the halogen lights. But David didn't flinch. He held up his phone and showed them the live tracking of the car carrying Leo. He told them that the police were already intercepting the transport vehicle. Then, he dropped the real hook. He told them that he hadn't just frozen the accounts. He had discovered that the offshore fund Mike had been using was actually a front for a money laundering scheme involving a local developer. David had sent the data to the FBI an hour ago. As the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, Mike's face went pale. He looked at Sarah, and for the first time, there was no performance. He realized she had used him, and just as much as she had used David, but the biggest shock was still to come. The lawyer who had been helping them stepped out of the shadows, but he wasn't looking at Sarah anymore. He walked straight over to David and handed him a digital recorder. The lawyer looked at the stunned couple and said that David had offered him double the emergency fee to record their entire conversation at the car. David pressed play, and the speakers filled the hangar with Sarah's voice, clearly discussing how she planned to dispose of Mike once they landed, so she wouldn't have to share the money. The two traitors looked at each other, and the betrayal within the betrayal was finally laid bare. The silence in the hangar was heavier than the sound of the sirens. Sarah looked at Mike, and Mike looked at the digital recorder in David's hand. The recording continued to play, Sarah's voice cold and clinical as she explained to the lawyer on tape that Mike was unstable and would be easy to frame for the embezzlement once they were across the border. The physical change in Mike was instant. The man who had been David's best friend for 20 years suddenly looked like a cornered animal. He turned towards Sarah, his face a mask of disbelief. He had risked everything for her, his career, his reputation, his brotherhood with David, only to find out he was just another line item she intended to delete. Sarah didn't even try to deny it. She backed away, her heels clicking sharply on the concrete floor. She turned her venom on David, accusing him of destroying their family, shouting that he was a boring, pathetic man who drove her to this. It was a classic manipulation tactic, a desperate attempt to shift the guilt. But David didn't feel the sting anymore. He felt nothing but a calm, icy resolve. The police arrived in a swarm of blue and red lights, but the drama was far from over. As the officers moved in to detain Mike and Sarah for questioning regarding the financial fraud, Sarah's phone rang. It was her mother. David had timed the exposure perfectly. Over the speaker, her mother's voice was trembling with a mix of shame and fury. She told Sarah that she was being cut off entirely. The trust fund, the family estate, and the social standing she valued more than her own husband were gone. But the real pressure came from the lawyer. Seeing the ship sinking, he decided to save himself. He handed David a second set of documents, the real ones. He admitted that Mike had been keeping a black book of all the illegal transactions they had performed over the last 2 years. Mike had kept it as leverage against Sarah, just in case she tried to screw him over. It was a circle of traitors, each holding a knife to the other's back. As the officers began to lead them away, Mike broke. He started screaming about the money laundering, pointing his finger at Sarah and shouting that the whole thing was her idea. He offered to testify against her right there on the tarmac if they would let him go. Sarah responded by spitting on him, her professional mask completely shattered. David watched them tear each other apart, realizing that he didn't even need to punish them. They were doing a better job of it themselves. However, the hook of the evening wasn't the arrest. As David sat on the bumper of a police cruiser, watching the tow truck hook up Mike's sedan, his phone buzzed. It was a text from the driver of the transport vehicle that was supposed to be taking Leo to the special camp. The message was short: the boy in the car. He never was. David's heart stopped. He looked over at Sarah, who was being pushed into the back of a patrol car. She caught his eye and gave him a slow, terrifying smile. It was the smile of someone who knew they had lost the battle but had hidden a bomb under the floorboards. David ran to the officer in charge, showing him the text. They stopped the patrol car, and David demanded to know where his son was. Sarah sat behind the glass, her voice muffled but clear through the open window. She told David that if he wanted to see Leo again, he had 10 minutes to tell the police that the financial records he provided were errors and that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. She had anticipated the failure of the flight. She had hidden Leo somewhere else entirely, using a different transport service that David hadn't tracked. She was using their son as a final bargaining chip for her freedom. David looked at the detective, then back at the woman he had once loved. He realized that Sarah wasn't just a cheater or a thief. She was someone who was willing to gamble with her child's life to avoid a prison cell. He had to make a choice: let her walk and save Leo, or trust his own logic to find his son before the clock ran out. He looked at Mike, who was sitting in another car, sobbing and begging for a lawyer. David walked over to him, grabbed him by the collar, and whispered something in his ear, a detail about Mike's own daughter that only David knew. He told Mike that if he didn't give up the location of the backup plan, David would make sure Mike's family knew every disgusting detail of what he had done. Mike's eyes widened. He looked at Sarah, then back at David. He realized that David was no longer the nice guy he could push around. In a shaking voice, Mike gave up a name and an address, a lake house 2 hours north that belonged to Mike's cousin. David didn't wait for the police. He jumped into his truck and sped away. But as he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A black SUV that had been parked at the edge of the airstrip the entire time pulled out and began following him. Staying exactly 3 car lengths behind, the drive to the lake house felt like a descent into a nightmare. Every time David glanced at the rearview mirror, the black SUV was there, a shadow that refused to fade. He pushed his truck to its absolute limit, weaving through the dark country roads, his mind racing through the logic of Sarah's final move. She was a woman who always had a backup for her backup. If Mike had given up the location, Sarah likely knew it was compromised. As David pulled into the gravel driveway of the isolated lake house, the SUV finally slowed down and stopped at the gate, blocking the only exit. David didn't wait. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from his glove box and ran toward the cabin. The front door was unlocked, swaying slightly in the wind. Inside, the house was silent, smelling of stale wood and damp air. He found Leo in a small back bedroom. The boy was sitting on the floor, confused but unharmed, his hands tucked into his hoodie. He looked up at David with a mix of fear and relief that broke David's heart. There was no special camp staff, no guards. It was just a cold, empty room. David realized then that the guards were never intended to be inside. They were outside, waiting to see if David would show up alone. As David led Leo toward the front door, the headlights of the black SUV cut through the darkness, illuminating the living room. A man stepped out of the vehicle. It wasn't Mike, and it wasn't the police. It was the developer David had flagged in the money laundering report, the man whose career David had just ended with a single email to the FBI. The man didn't come for the money. He came for retribution. He stood on the porch, a silhouette against the blinding lights, and told David that some debts aren't paid in cash. He explained that Sarah had promised him David would go away quietly in exchange for his help with the offshore accounts. Since Sarah couldn't deliver, the developer decided to take matters into his own hands. In that moment, David realized the ultimate flaw in Sarah's logic. She thought she was the smartest person in the room, but she had invited monsters into their lives, thinking she could control them with charm and lies. She hadn't just betrayed her husband, she had endangered her son. David pushed Leo back into the house and locked the door. He knew he couldn't win a physical fight, but he still had the one thing these people didn't: the data. He stepped out onto the porch, holding his phone high. He didn't plead for his life. Instead, he told the man that the FBI already had a dead man switch on his server. If David didn't check in every 60 minutes, a second, more detailed file containing the developer's private home address and his children's school schedules would be sent to every rival gang in the city. It was a bluff born of pure desperation. But David delivered it with the cold, calculated tone of a man who had nothing left to lose. The developer stared at him for a long, agonizing minute. The logic of the situation had shifted. Killing David wouldn't save his business. It would only guarantee his own destruction. Without a word, the man got back into the SUV and backed out of the driveway, disappearing into the night. The aftermath was a slow, quiet rebuilding. Sarah and Mike were both sentenced to significant prison time for fraud, embezzlement, and kidnapping. Because of the evidence David provided, the court granted him full custody of Leo and a protective order that ensured Sarah would never get within a mile of them again. The moral of the story became clear as David stood in their new, smaller apartment months later, watching Leo finish his homework. Sarah had tried to build a life on a foundation of lies, thinking that she could manipulate reality to suit her desires. She believed that people were just pieces on a board to be moved or discarded. But a life built on deceit is like a house built on sand. It only takes one person seeking the truth to make the whole thing wash away. David lost his house, his business, and his best friend. But as he sat down to dinner with his son, he realized he had gained something far more valuable: a life where he didn't have to look for cracks in the walls. He had lost the math of his old life, but for the first time, the numbers finally added up to peace.